Brothers and sisters, comrades and friends, Assalamu alaikum, peace be on all of you. I'm not described as controversial anywhere in the world except in Canada. And that's one of the areas that I want to explore this evening. But as I gaze around at this absolutely gigantic crowd, I have to say, take a look around, Jason Kenney. Put this in your pipe and smoke it. Because, as any bookseller could have told him, the minute you try to ban a book, it immediately goes into the bestseller list. And our campaign is now in the bestseller list. There is no other campaign that can organize a 12-city tour of Canada and bring literally thousands, in this case more than 1,000 people, to a public meeting on a cold winter's night. So thank you, up to a point, Mr. Kenney, because you definitely made me famous in Canada, and that's a good thing if it brings people to rallies such as this. But the price that's been paid for Mr. Kenney's actions is considerable. It is not an easy thing to handle being described in official Canadian government documents publicized around the world that I was not just a supporter of terrorism, but a member of a terrorist organization, and that I was a threat to Canada's national security. This despite the fact that we discovered in the court process that Canada's security services, who will be here tonight, I'm sure, and they're welcome, Canada's security services in writing told Jason Kenney and Stephen Harper that this allegation was false, that I was not a member of a terrorist organization, and neither was I a threat to Canada's national security. And it would have come as quite a surprise if I had been. It would have come as a surprise to Her Majesty the Queen that for 25 years, sitting in her Parliament, was a member of a terrorist organization, a threat to the security of a Commonwealth country. It would have come as a surprise to Mr. Speaker that all the while that he was recognizing me as regularly elected the Parliamentary Debater of the Year over and over, that in fact I was sitting with some dangerous weaponry just waiting for the moment to strike. It would have come as a surprise to the Bush administration in the United States of America, throughout which I traveled as a public speaker in virtually every state in the Union. It would have come as a surprise to the Canadian security services, because, as Irene just told you, I was regularly visiting and speaking in Canada before this absurd and ridiculous but reprehensible pack of lies was told to the Canadian public by its own government. The judge, in a 60-page caning of Jason Kenney, make quite a good movie that, the caning of Kenney. Might be ex-certificate, but who knows what he gets up to in his personal life, and I don't care. In that 60-page caning It repays reading if you have not read it. The minister is found, is judged, is ruled to have deliberately deceived the people of Canada about the reasons for the ban on my travelling here 18 months ago. On page after page of those 60 pages, the government is found to have bent the laws of Canada in pursuit of their weird, it's the only word for it, weird and bizarre and virtually unique in the world attempt to criminalize support for the Palestinian people. And I must say, that I cannot think of any democratic country where a minister could be caned over 60 pages in such a way and not have to tender his resignation. I cannot think of any country in which that could be true. I can't think of a country where if he didn't tender his resignation, the Prime Minister would have sacked him. But then the Prime Minister could not have sacked him because, as becomes clear in the court discovery process, if you'll forgive the phrase, I know I'm getting into deep waters, Harper was in bed with Kenny on this whole miserable affair, absolutely entwined with Kenny in this whole miserable affair. And this leads me to a much bigger issue than my own fate at the hands of these people. Because my fate at the hands of these people is nowhere near as important as your fate at the hands of these people. What is it about Canada that it has transformed itself, or its government has transformed the country's image in this way? I'm old enough to know of the time when Canada was admired, even loved in the world, as a peaceful place, as a place that looked to resolve conflicts rather than join them. I'm old enough to remember when those brave Americans who refused to participate in the barbaric assault on the people of Vietnam and fled to Canada for haven, safe haven, were welcomed here instead of sent back to prison by a government that you have today. It is inconceivable to me how Canada could have allowed its government to reduce this country, in the eyes of most of the world, to a virtual embassy of the most right-wing government of Israel that we have ever had. Mr. Kenny said, Mr. Harper said rather, just a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, and I'm quoting him, that Canada is ready to, and I quote, pay any price to support this government of Benjamin Netanyahu. He might have added, Kennedy-esque, bear any burden to support this right-wing extremist government in Tel Aviv. Why? What's in that for you? Were you asked if you wanted to pay any price to support Netanyahu's Israel? Is there anything in Canada's national interest to be gained from such a thing? He says, after the trouncing of Canada in the election to the Security Council of the United Nations, that this defeat was a result of Canada's, quote, unstinting support, unquote, for Israel. However, he said, it's a badge of honor. No, Mr. Harper, it's a badge of shame on Canada. It's a badge of shame. And that's how the rest of the world sees it. And what's wrong with the Canadian media that they go along with this so comprehensively? You've been kicked out of the United Arab Emirates. You need to get a visa now if you visit Dubai. And we saw yesterday in the newspapers a retired Canadian diplomat described this government's determination to be the last cold warrior standing. That's the problem here, isn't it? That you have a government that is the last Alamo of George W. Bush neocon madness, voodoo diplomacy, voodoo politics. Bush is gone. The Bushites are gone south of the border. But they still have a dead-end, last-ditch rear guard here in Canada. And whilst I wouldn't dream of advising you for whom to vote, I hope when you get the chance, you take it to recover Canada's reputation in the world when that general election comes along. I believe in free debate. There are limits to free debate. There are limits set by the laws of libel and defamation. If I were to libel someone this evening, it could prove an expensive business, as Jason Kenney is about to find out in the Canadian courts. I know that's a mixed blessing for you as Canadian taxpayers. This whole affair has already cost your country a pretty penny, and it's going to cost much more. But the good news is this: every penny, every cent that I win in compensation from the Government of Canada and its hirelings in Kenny's office, every cent will be spent here in Canada building an even greater anti-war movement here in this country. And there are also other barriers that those who advocate free speech must have cognizance of. And they include the prohibition, the just and righteous prohibition of speech which whips up racial or religious hatred. I have never in my life, as a man of the left, since I was a child, I joined the labor movement when I was 13 years old. I've spent all of my life fighting racism and hatred. How could I conceivably be accused of being against Jews? It is as absurd as it is offensive. Marx was a Jew. Trotsky was a Jew. Einstein was a Jew. Epstein was a Jew. Joe Slovo, the hero of the South African liberation movement, was a Jew. There are Jews all over Canada in our campaign for justice for the Palestinian people. There are Jews in Israel itself marching with us. We have nothing. How could we? We have nothing. How could we? We have nothing against Jews. We are against the racist apartheid political system of Zionism as practiced by Netanyahu's Israel today. That's what we are against.